Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phillip Nicholas, and I'm an archivist, historian, and genealogist. I am also the owner and founder of Genealogy Detective Caribbean LLC, which I recently just started. I'm also an archives technician at the National Archives and Records Administration. And for full disclosure, I am not conducting this presentation on behalf of the National Archives. I have been into genealogy since I was young and have been working on my own genealogy and client work for approximately 14 years. My specific interest in Caribbean genealogy stems from my background, and I am of Jamaican descent. My mother is from Jamaica, and my father is from the UK, born to Jamaican parents. Today, I'm conducting a presentation on Caribbean genealogy, focusing on the challenges to tracking your West Indian ancestors. All right, so getting started. Before you start conducting your research, you will want to gather as much oral history, information, and details from your family members. These processes are vital steps for researching your ancestors. First, you want to interview your relatives, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Next, you want to take notes, but also remember to consider the unexpected and other possibilities when listening to family lore, although sometimes there are truths to them. Then you want to create family diagrams, starting with you to your parents and moving to your grandparents and including your aunts, uncles, and cousins as a point of reference. So populations. So over the period of indigenous settlement and European colonization, there have been different groups who have settled, lived, in or called the West Indies home. Here are some of the groups. So you have your West Africans, who mostly came primarily during the transatlantic slave trade from Ghana, Ivory Coast, also known then as the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And that was primarily known as the Bida Biafra. Then you had your Congo and Angolans. You had slaves, West Africans coming from Benin and Togo, Senegambia, and Mali. Then you also had your European settlers coming from Spain, Portugal, the British Isles consisting of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Then you had your French settlers, you had your Dutch settlers, and your Germans. Next, you had South Asian groups, primarily coming from India, mostly from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Adwad, and the southern regions. And you had your East Asians, so your Chinese, mostly coming from Guangdong in Hong Kong. And you had your Middle Eastern groups. So you had your Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. And you had your Lebanese groups coming in the late 19th century. And then, of course, prior to European settlement, you had your indigenous groups, the Arawak/Taino people, and the Mosquito territory, and then you had your Caribs. Here are some basic terminologies that you'll want to familiarize yourself because you might come across them while researching your ancestors in the West Indies. So you might come across the terminologies mulatto, Korojun, Masti, Sambo, and these were used specifically to identify people of mixed African and European ancestry. Then you had terms you might come across as brown or people of color, which was usually used to identify people of mixed ancestry or in sometimes people of Indian descent. Then you had another term that you might come across, Kuli, which was used specifically more so to identify people who are Indian descent coming as indentured laborers or contract workers. Then you had your Coromantee, which was usually used to identify people who were coming from the Gold Coast, primarily Ghana, Ivory Coast, and possibly sometimes Benin. Then you had the word, you might come across the word Creole, which is usually used in this specific instance to identify people who were inhabitants or born on the islands. Then you had dissenter, which was usually used to affiliate with a person who was associated with the Protestant church, but not associated with the state church, which at the times was the Anglican church. Then you might come across the word Igbo, which is usually used to describe a person from the Bight of Biafra, Nigeria, and it was usually refers to Igbo. You might come across the word Maroon, which was usually used to identify a person or who was of descent of fugitive slaves who lived in isolated and free communities. All right, so historical context of the West Indies. So as I've been alluding to, like with all genealogy, it's important to understand the historical context of the West Indies. So for instance, it's important to know when groups were migrating to the West Indies and when events were occurring on the islands that may have impacted the lives of your ancestor. One major point to know is when slave revolts, major waves of immigration, and natural disasters occurred because they most likely affected the lives of your ancestor. For example, in the late 19th century, there was waves of people in the West Indies, like Barbados, Jamaica, and Bahamas, and others migrating to Latin American countries like Panama to work on the canal in Colón, in the sugar and banana estates in Cuba and Costa Rica. Another point to remember is when slavery was abolished in 1834 and the end of the apprenticeship period in 1838, which was the official end of slavery and when the British government was compensating the former slave owners for their enslaved property. Therefore, it is important when researching your ancestors that you know what records will be specific to you. All right, so the British West Indies. So the British West Indies consist of several island nations and territories. So you have Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, the British Virgin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Belize, Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, Montserrat, Grenada, the Cayman Islands, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. All right, so parishes, Jamaica. Next, it's important to understand the geography and changing borders of parishes and or districts in the country you are researching. For Jamaica, there are currently 14 parishes and 3 counties in Jamaica. So the current parishes that you have are Clarendon, Hanover, Kingston, Manchester, Portland, St. Andrew, St. Catherine, St. Anne, St. Elizabeth, St. James, St. Mary, St. Thomas, Trelawney, and Westmoreland. The counties that you currently have are Cornwall, Middlesex, and Surrey. So the concept of a parish in Jamaica is similar in like a state in the United States. It is important to understand while conducting your family history that there were many parishes before and some of the towns were part of a different parish. For example, you could have family from the parish of Manchester, but when you are researching your ancestors in 1811, you will realize that the parish didn't exist. And perhaps your ancestors may have lived in either St. Elizabeth, Clarendon, and or Vere, since Manchester was created from those 3 parishes. Overall, the parish borders were not fixed until 1866. All right, so parishes for Barbados. For Barbados, like Jamaica, parishes were established on the island in 1629 after the English settlers arrived. The English initially established 6 parishes: St. Lucy, St. Peter, St. James, St. Thomas, St. Michael, and Christchurch. But later in 1645, 5 more parishes were established. St. Andrews, St. Joseph, St. George, St. John, and St. Philip, for a total of 11 parishes, which are the current parishes today in Barbados. The capital, Bridgetown, is located in the parish of St. Michael. You will want to research and understand the parishes and districts for countries in the West Indies before conducting your family research. All right, so what records are available online? Luckily for those researching their ancestors in the West Indies, there are many readily available resources online. The primary source that will be most relevant to researchers interested in the West Indies is Family Search, which I have included the URL and is also included in your handout. There is no subscription fee, and all you must do is create a username and password to access and view the records. For Jamaica, you will want to view the Jamaica Civil Registration and the Jamaica Church of England parish transcripts, which I have highlighted. So for instance, for the Jamaica Civil Registration, you'll have your birth registers, which are from 1878 to 1930. You'll have your marriage registers, which are from 1880 to 1950. You'll have your death registers, which are from 1878 to 1995, and sometimes it includes ones for 1999. And also, there are also wills that are available from 1756 to 1930. So see, these are some of the records that will be specific and records that you will want to check out. So here's what the site looks like for Jamaica. All right, so more accessible records. For Barbados, the records available on Family Search will be relevant to you as well, which I've highlighted. For the Bahamas, Family Search will also be most relevant in terms of locating vital records. There are some indexes available for the islands, Anguilla, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Grenada currently, but most of the country's records are in repositories on the islands or in the former colonial offices. For the more populated countries like Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, researchers will need to contact and or visit those island repositories because now there is little to none records available online. So here's what the site looks like for Barbados. And then here's what the site looks like for the Bahamas. All right, so images of digitized records. Once you know what records are readily available, you will want to familiarize yourself with the information available in the records. For birth records in Jamaica, which I've included a copy of one in the upper left-hand corner, includes date of birth, birthplace, name of child, if provided, gender, names of the parents, including mother's maiden name, the father's occupation, and the witness. If the parents are not married, only the mother's name of the child is listed, and her occupation due to an Old English law, which has been changed for recent births. For baptismal records in Jamaica, which I have included a copy of one in the upper right-hand corner, includes the name of a child or individual baptized, the date of birth, the date of baptism, the parents' names, the place of residency, and the father's occupation. So here are some more images. For civil marriage records, the date of marriage is listed, the names of the individuals getting married, their prior marital status, their occupations if they have one, their age at the time of marriage, the parish and town of residency at the time of marriage, the names of their parents, and the names of the witnesses. For civil death records, the date and place of death is listed, the name of the individual, the gender, the condition, so their marital status, the age at the time of death, the occupation. In the case of a married woman, though, her husband's name and occupation was listed, but this was not always the case. The cause of death, the name, and the signature of the informant is also included. So more images. The church and vital records in Barbados and the Bahamas include similar information like Jamaica. For the burial record for Barbados, in the upper left-hand corner, there is a date of burial, name of the individual buried, the age, occupation, if listed, the residency, and place of birth. For the birth record for the Bahamas, in the upper right-hand corner, the date of birth is listed, sometimes the name of the child, the gender, the name of the parents, including the parent's maiden name, the father's occupation, and the date of baptism. All right, another resource that you want to be familiar with is Ancestry.com. Former British colonial dependencies slave register from 1813 to 1834. So after 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act, the British colonies attempted to combat the act of illicit transportation of slaves from Africa to the British colonies by keeping a register of slaves who had been called lawfully enslaved. Registration generally occurred once every 3 years. I've included a URL for the website in your handout. The slave returns contain the given name of the slave, the baptized name of the slave, if available, and if so, the given name may have been included, the residence in the parish of the slave, the gender of the slave, the origin of the enslaved person, such as their racial background, Black or mixed race, the age of the enslaved person, the nationality of the enslaved person, whether the enslaved person was born in Jamaica, the Bahamas, or Barbados, so they would be listed as Creole, or born in Africa, and it would simply just list African. The name of the mother, if available, the name of the owner, and in some cases, the name of the estate. All right, another resource that is available on Ancestry.com is the U.S. Panama Canal Zone, the employment records and sailing list from 1884 to 1937. And I recommend this resource for researchers who have ancestors who have migrated, worked, and lived in Panama from 1884 to 1937. So people from the West Indies were migrating to Panama for economic opportunities. Many of the records in this collection contain applications for the individuals who were employed or migrated to Panama. The applications contain vital information for genealogical purposes. For example, birth dates, birthplaces, photos, spousal information, locations in Panama, and much more. Another resource, again, the Legacies of British Slavery site. So the Legacies of British Slavery Center was established at the University College London and based off earlier projects at the university tracing the impact of slave ownership and the role Black and Brown people played in the development of modern Britain and the legacies in the Caribbean. I've included a URL for the website in your handout. The online database contains the names of the slave owners, the estates, the plantations, and livestock pens they owned, the maps, the claims of the owners and or affiliates of the estate submitted for compensation, and the amount of money they were compensated, and much more. So some of the features that I highly recommend is, of course, using the advanced search to search the database to narrow down to Pacific estates. Some of the search strategies I recommend are like using the Boolean search, and or searching with keywords. All right, another resource is the Endangered Archives Program. So the British Library in London supports a digital project initiative called the Endangered Archives Program. It's a team of archivists, researchers, and volunteers who are digitizing cultural heritage and archives around the world in danger of being lost. The project consists of digitizing efforts in the West Indies. Here are some of the archival records from the West Indies that have been digitized. So you have manumissions of slaves from 1747 to 1838, indentured records, plantation records, Roman Catholic Church records, and correspondences. I have also included the URL for this website in your handout and also in this slide. All right, so more resources. There are many more resources available for you to conduct your genealogy, but you will have to visit the repositories on the islands or in the former colonial offices. For Jamaican records, you will want to visit Jamaica and or the UK, or you can request a genealogical research to be done on your family, which can take several weeks. The contact information is listed on your bookmarks. So one location that I highly recommend is the Jamaica Archives in Spanish Town, which you'll be able to access to legal, administrative records, which includes some manumissions, slave registers, parish registers, and crop accounts, and additionally more church records. You will also get access to maps. So that's a good repository that I highly recommend. Another one is the Registrar's General Department in Twickenham, which has vital records, birth, marriages, and deaths. And these also includes the years after the years that only Family Search only provides. So it goes up to the present day. And in addition, they include wills. All right. So additional resources. For Barbados, you will want to visit the Archives and or Registration Office to acquire the latest vital records, wills, deeds, almanacs, and administrative records, among many other records that are available. The same goes for the other islands in the West Indies. You'll want to visit their repositories and or contact them to see if they can provide consultation and or resources. And I have included these contact information for some of these repositories in your handout. Again, there are other repositories that you'll want to visit, like the Roman Catholic Chancery in Kingston, if you have ancestors who were Catholic, the National Archives at Kew in the UK, which contains the slave registers and wills, the National Archives here in the United States at College Park, Maryland, which contains marriage licenses for Protestants in Panama from 1904 to 1979, mostly in the Canal Zone area. You also get more Panama records, your consular records. The Library of Congress is another place I recommend. There's a lot of maps of the Caribbean islands, plantation records for Worthy Park Estate in St. Catherine, Jamaica. And then you'll also want to check out some of the national libraries in the West Indies, which contains maps, digital collections, and more plantation records. So once you're aware of all the resources that are available, you will be ready to conduct your research. All right, so one of the challenges to tracing your West Indian roots is census records. So census records in the British West Indies. There are census records for the British West Indies, but most of these records contain statistical information instead of biographical information, similar to the census records in the United States. So you will not get names, addresses, and be able to suss out family nucleus in family networks, so that will be hard to obtain. Another challenge is understanding the information from immigration records, so examining immigration and passenger lists. You should consider searching for and examining immigration and naturalization records of your ancestors and or extended relatives who migrated to either the United States, the UK, and or Canada. Many of these records are available on Ancestry.com and FindMyPast.com. Locating these records are important because they might contain vital information for genealogical purposes. For example, this screenshot of a passenger list of people from Jamaica coming to the United States in 1943 during World War II as guest workers contains information about the guest workers, such as the passengers' names, their age, gender, marital status, occupation, nationality, racial background, birthplace, and last permanent address. Sometimes the passengers list contains information on the back pertaining to the individuals listed on the voyage. For example, a name of a close associate of the passenger, usually a spouse, relative, common-in-law, wife, or lover. You also get information to their destinations and other additional information, which you can view in the captured screenshots here. All right, so examining naturalization records. Another recommendation I suggest when getting started is to examine naturalization records of your ancestors. Naturalization records also contain valuable information, for example, birth dates, birth locations in the West Indies, spousal information, marriage dates, and information pertaining to children, which you can see in this image of a naturalization record. The information from this record is pertinent and will be specific to you when tracing your ancestry back in Jamaica. You will be aware of the location and time your ancestors lived. So in this example, I have a naturalization record for an ancestral cousin named George Lindsay Bryan. And here it lists the day he was born and where. So he was born in Clarendon, Jamaica, in the British West Indies. It provides a little bit more personal details, the name of his wife and his children. All right, so while searching the Jamaican civil registration, I found a birth certificate of George Lindsay Bryan, who was born on September 12, 1888 in Kensale, Clarendon, Jamaica. This information matched with the information listed on his naturalization record. So this discovery emphasizes the importance of augmenting your research with various documents like immigration records. And here I have a photo of George Bryan. So tracing your ancestors born out of wedlock. One of the most challenging aspects of researching your family history in the West Indies is tracing your ancestors born out of wedlock. This primary reason exists because of an old English law, which I've already stated, that if a child was born illegitimately or out of birth or out of wedlock, the father's name was not listed on the birth record. Now, there are instances where I have found that the clerk recorded both the names of the parents on a birth record, although the parents were not married, but this was not always the case. One approach is to carefully examine all the information provided on the birth record. If researching a recent ancestor, you might want to consult with your family members to see if anyone knows the names of the parents. So here's a copy of my great-grandmother's birth record. No father's name is listed, but there is a James Morgan listed as the occupier of the residence. she was born, who was the informant for the birth record. So after consulting with my grandmother, she did confirm that James Morgan was indeed my great-grandmother's father. The next challenge I encountered was locating the birth record of her mother, the mother of my great-grandmother, Louise Gale. Another strategy to locate the birth record of an ancestor is to gather more information from other children the ancestor may have had. In this case, I located the birth records of all the children that Louise Gale had given birth to. Here I provided 2 birth records of additional relatives, the birth records of my great-grandaunt and my great-granduncle, also children of Louise Gale. One thing that stood out to me while conducting my research is I noticed on both records Emma Morgan appears as the informant. So, this made me curious. Was Emma Morgan a relative or perhaps even the mother? So what I did next was decide to look for birth records of all the children that Emma Morgan had. So I then searched for the birth records, but this time I searched with Emma Morgan as the mother. I found a birth record for Evelyn Louise, born to an Emma Morgan at Portland Cottage in Clarendon, Jamaica. I then consulted with my grandmother, who confirmed that Emma Morgan was indeed the mother of Louise Gale, and she knew her when she was a child as Muma, which in Jamaican patois means mother. To further confirm family mysteries of unidentified ancestors, I recommend researchers turn to DNA. I searched my autosomal DNA matches on Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, and GEDmatch, and I found on Ancestry DNA a DNA match was the grandson of Jane Morgan, living in Costa Rica, where Jane and her husband had migrated to, who is listed as the informant in Louise's birth record. Jane Morgan was the sister of Emma Morgan, my 3 times great-grandmother. Under Ancestry DNA shared matches features, I recognized the DNA match also shared matches with other descendants of Emma Morgan and Louise Gale, my 3rd cousin and my maternal grandmother's 1st cousin, and myself, who took the DNA test, which further confirmed the connections. I also recommend researchers take a DNA test for uncovering family mysteries, especially when they reach the end of the paper trail or can no longer find any more information. All right, so to further confirm and contextualize your research, I recommend you augment your research with maps. Here I have a map of the parish of Clarendon, which I took a screenshot of the areas my ancestors were living at to show the movement of family. Now this map is a more narrowed map, primarily of the southern part of Clarendon, which was formerly known as Vere. And here, as I point out, I have Portland Cottage, and up above that I have Lioneltown, and from Lioneltown I have over to Salt River, which was the path my ancestors took. All right, next, tracing ancestry beyond 1838. So tracing your ancestry to slavery. Another challenge in Jamaican genealogy and genealogy of the West Indies, the British West Indies and Pacific, is tracing your ancestors of African descent back to slavery. Oh, remember, slavery was abolished in 1834 and the apprenticeship period ended in 1838. I've included the historical dates in the handout. One strategy to trace your ancestors back to slavery is to find a birth or baptismal record for your direct ancestor that was born close to 1834 or 1838. Many of the former slaves continue to remain on the same estate that were enslaved or in the surrounding area. Here I have a copy of my 3 times great-grandfather, James Nicholas, his baptismal record. And he and his parents were living at Grange, which is located in Long Bay, Portland. At this time, it was known as the parish of St. Thomas in the East. So next, I researched all nearby plantations in the slave registers that listed a Nicholas on the estate. All right. I found a Nicholas family enslaved on the Elmwood plantation, which is located at Long Bay. I was able to uncover the names of James's parents and siblings. Many of the names had passed down to descendants of this family, such as George, James, Selena, Christina, and John. I also found a slave marriage of George Nicholas and Christina Hazel. Here's the entry of my 4 times great-grandfather, James Nicholas, in the slave register on the Elmwood plantation as the son of Christina Hazel, and it shows the day he was born, which lists May 20th, 1826. And he's identified as Negro, so Black, listed as a Creole, so born in Jamaica. So next, I decided to turn to locating the entry of George Nicholas. Initially, I could not find an entry for George Nicholas, but I later found a George Nicholas patent in the 1817 slave register returned for the Elmwood plantation, who was the son of a James Patton and Polly Patton. He was around the correct age of my James Nicholas. I was later able to confirm that this George Nicholas Patton was indeed my George Nicholas after searching the entire slave return for the Elmwood plantation and studying the naming patterns of the Nicholas family. Apparently, sometime later, George's surname Patton was dropped, and his descendants later went by Nicholas as the surname. I also found a slave marriage record of James Patton and Polly Patton. Next, I turned to locating the entries of both James Patton and Polly Patton. All right, I was able to find both the entries of James Patton and Polly Patton in the 1817 slave return for the Elmwood plantation. So here, James Patton, who was previously known as September, is listed as Negro, Black, at the age of 52, and African. I have Polly Patton below, who's formerly known as Industry, listed as Negro, Black, age 40, African. To my surprise, I was able to trace my direct lineage back to my enslaved African ancestors. When tracing your enslaved ancestors in the West Indies, it is possible to uncover an African ancestor in the slave returns in 1817. Since the slave trade was abolished in 1807, and many African slaves were still alive by then. Through the paper trail, I've identified 16 enslaved African ancestors so far who have survived the transatlantic slave trade and were living in Jamaica. 14 on my paternal side and 2 on my maternal side. Next, I turn to DNA again. This time, taking a Y-DNA patrilineal test. As a direct descendant of James Patton, Through my father to father's line, I carried his Y DNA. I tested with 2 companies, Family Tree DNA and African Ancestry, to learn more about my African ancestor. You can also test with 23andMe. Ancestry DNA currently does not have a Y DNA patrilineal test and an X DNA mitochondrial test, but eventually, I believe they will eventually have a test. I was able to confirm that I belong to haplogroup E, which exists in sub-Saharan Africa. So next, tracing your ancestors born free. Now, it is also important to be aware that when tracing your ancestors of African descent back to slavery, that your ancestor was probably not enslaved. There was a significant portion of free Blacks and free people of color mixed race ancestors in the West Indies. I also recommend to trace your ancestry as close to 1834 and 1838 and examine the details of the records. Here I have included a baptismal record of Joseph Newell, my 3 times great-grandfather, which lists him born on July 15, 1838, to George Newell and his wife Jane, and they were living in Greenfield. This occurred in the parish of St. John. Next, I found other baptisms and birth records for Joseph's siblings. Here I've included one for his sister. Jane Pellington Newell was born September 11th, 1845, again to George Newell and his wife Jane Tawes Newell, formerly known Pellington. Also, something that was interesting that stood out to me was the occupation of George Newell, who is listed as a planter, and in combination with his background, which lists him as a brown man, which made me curious. At this time period, how did somebody who could have possibly been formerly enslaved next become a planter? And what did brown men mean? Well, knowing that, I knew that usually referred to somebody who was either mixed race descent or somebody of Indian descent. So I was curious to learn a little bit more. Next, I decided to locate a baptismal record for George Newell, and I was able to find one. So here, George Newell was baptized November 12, 1813, in the parish of St. Dorothy at the age of 1 and 10 months. He was listed as a quadroon free son of Joseph Newell, who was a white man, and Elizabeth Bonner. Next, I found a will for Joseph Newell, which helped me link the prior information I found in George's Newell and previous documents. See here in the will of Joseph Newell, which was approved October 10th, 1817 in Jamaica, Joseph identifies his son, George Newell, among other children that he lists in his will. And he lists and mentions that George Newell was the son of Elizabeth Bonner, which he identifies her by name in his will as a former slave or a slave who had previously passed away. Joseph also bequests the remainder of his slaves to his son under the legal guardianship of William Jackson and Alexander Lumsden. So from there, after reading that, I was curious to learn a little bit more about George Newell's life as a free child, later a young man during slavery, especially after reading that his father bequests his slaves to him. Later, I found slave return for George Newell, but this time he was listed as the slave owner. So here In the slave return on the left-hand side, we have George Newell listed under the guardianship of Alexander Lumsden, which again, that's connecting to the will. And the names of the enslaved people that was owned by George Newell under the guardianship of Alexander Lumsden, which lists their racial background, their ages, and their status, whether or not they were born on the island or African. And then in the next return, slave register for 1832 on the right-hand side, I have this time George Newell listed, but not under the guardianship. So in 1832, he was much older and no longer needed legal guardianship. And it lists the name of the enslaved person he had owned, but is now releasing them for sale. So as a free man of color who owned other people of African descent, kind of struck me emotionally and as odd because I wasn't aware initially of this family history connection. However, I was aware that slavery was a prime economic opportunity in Jamaica, and many freed brown and black people also purchased and owned slaves, although there were restrictions. In addition, although George inherited slaves from his father, he probably also considered the opportunity to make money for himself and for a family. So this highlights the complexity of slavery, a system that was racialized in the Americas, and shows that what you may have thought about your ancestors based on their origins and or status may be different than what occurred. So as I continued to research George, I found another linking document on the Legacy of British Slavery site that shows George was compensated for his former enslaved property. This document continues to highlight the differences and the unusual stories in the history of slavery in the Americas and adding to the complexity of slavery. When tracing your ancestors that were free people of color in the West Indies, there is a probability that your ancestor owned slaves. All right, so for the acknowledgements, here are some of the keys to conducting a successful research. I suggest you learn about the records and history and or consult experts if you're a beginner. Join genealogy discussion boards online because you may encounter other researchers studying and or researching the same families. Continue to augment your research using all available records, resources, and tools, including newspapers, maps, and DNA to get the most accurate results. And last, remember, please take breaks. I know this can be a very addicting process. So now I would like to thank Dawn Wilson and RELIC for giving me this opportunity to share my research and presenting a beginning tutorial for how to conduct West Indian genealogy. And thanks to everyone who could join for this presentation, and happy Black History Month. If you miss anything, please feel free to email me.